Thank you very much for inviting me here, Randy, and thanks to the Kirok people for housing us here. Let's see, so this advances. So my name is John Miedema. I have a company in Klamath, Oregon, where I've been doing research and development around biochar for about the last 15 years or so. It's located at a timber yard, and my background's actually around integrated systems. And so for a long time, I've been thinking about resilient, sustainable communities, really. And I think there'll be access to these slides, so I'm not gonna read them. You guys can read them later. I've got quite a few here. But essentially, it's about localized systems and what we do to do that as a society. And then this idea that we don't always come across the best ideas at the beginning. So when we look at like, how did we get here? You know, fossilized energy got us here basically, but fossilized energy has, you know, thousands and thousands of human hours contained in calorically right inside that barrel. So that allowed us to kind of have the leisure to, if we make the decision, to actually choose to get ourselves out of this mess. Right? So we don't have to rely on past mistakes. We can just look forward and make changes on an anticipatory design methodology. And I actually started thinking about this. I started commercial fishing at the age of 13. And so I spent a lot of time on the water between Puget Sound and up in Alaska. And about 30 years ago in Alaska, we caught mackerel and sunfish, you know, not like the big floating head kind of sunfish, right? It was very strange to me. And so I started going around to all the old timer highliners and asking them if they'd ever seen these fish in their nets before, and none of them had. So I started thinking about food systems and kind of what we're doing, because the other part of my background is in dairy, right? So I grew up around dairy and commercial fishing, and I just watched kind of specialization start to really screw up these systems. And that led me along a path that eventually led to biochar about 15 years ago when I was studying methane gas production. So what is biochar? Biochar is taking underutilized waste biomass and you heat it up without oxygen. And in the process, you essentially make a charcoal that has uses. But that charcoal started out as CO2 in the atmosphere. And photosynthesis pulled it into the structure of the plant. And now we've heated it up in a controlled environment and harvested the charcoal out. That charcoal has half-lives of a couple hundred to a couple thousand years. You know, think of the charcoal drawing on the cave wall, right? It's been there for a very long time, and there's various chemical reasons why that is. For today's discussion, just assume that that's true, right? We're not going to go into all the chemistry of this. But the other part about that is we can harvest energy in this reaction. It's an exothermic reaction. So if we do it properly, we can actually take waste biomass, and it always has to be waste biomass, and put it through this process and harvest energy, even chemical building block constituents that we're not going to get into today, but there's all kinds of good things we can do with that. And so that's an SEM of what this biomass looks like when you put it through this process. And essentially what you do is through thermochemical conversion, you drive all the cellulose and the hemicellulose out of the biomass, and what you're left with is the inherent structure of the biomass, right? So you have this beautiful lattice work of cell walls and edge structure. And that is a building block, right? So that building block starts out as a cation exchange material that can, I have very good results of picking up heavy metals. But we're all talking about nutrients today, right? And how do we get to nutrients? A lot of nutrients are anions, so they have a different charge. So thinking about this as a building block within this lattice work, started adding different minerals to it. I'll talk about that later, but this is a list of the things that it can do in the soil structure, right? It can reduce bulk density, improve porosity, increase cation exchange. Anyways, it goes on and on. What happens when it comes out raw, you want to add things to it. Agriculturally, one of the best things to do is put it through a compost. When you put it through a compost, microbes are involved with the labile carbon, and they consume it, put out organic acids. There's minerals in there. All this stuff gets to entrained on the edge structure of that lattice work, right? And what you're left behind with is this place for redox reactions and for the mineral exchanges and an edge structure for microbes to work off of. Microbes really like edge structure. If you think about diversity in the macroclimate, it's all on edge structures, where the forest meets the grassland, where the grassland meets the ocean, right? That's where you have high diversity. It's the same thing in the micro universe. Edge structure really matters and gives a lot of value to life. This is an illustration of why, at least agriculturally, it matters to activate your char, to put it through compost, to add organic acids to it. The top one is raw char, put into these plants at increasing amounts. The bottom one is one where some poor grad student had to pull little bits of charcoal out of a compost pile and put it without the compost into those plants. And you can see the differences as we increase the amount of that char that has microbes and organic acids and nutrients entrained with it. The original roots of this idea is actually quite ancient. It's human involvement with soils. So there was this story in soil science that there was highly fertile soils in the Amazon, what was known as the Terra Preta de Indio. And it was really considered to be a fantasy because soil scientists know that jungle soils are oxalic clays that are very low in fertility. But a man named William Sombrecht found it, interestingly enough, to go up the river in the Amazon in 1962 from the Netherlands and look for these soils, and he found them with the help of the local people. And what you have is, what they end up finding was these terra preta soils, which is the bottom pit there, and then the terra mulata soils, which are on the edges of the terra preta, and then the parent soil, which is on the top. Okay, so this is an illustration, and these soils are actually harvested like in Manaus or outside of Manaus and brought into Manaus in the Amazon still today because of the high fertility of these soils. Now, I've been fortunate enough to be in some of these pits, and they're anthropogenic. They're full of clay shards and kitchen midians and bones and all kinds of stuff. And whether the native people knew that or not, or they figured it out by getting rid of their waste, these soils were generated 10,000 years ago. The population of the Amazon 10,000 years ago wasn't a couple thousand people, it was a couple million. And these are connected by causeways. So this was a slash and char agriculture, not slash and burn. There's simple ways to make it. You know, it doesn't have to be complicated. It's one of the oldest things humans have been doing, and they've been doing it all over the world, is generating charcoal. So instead of lighting your fire, when you do a slash fire, if you light it from the top instead of the bottom, you can generate more char. If you do it in a pit, there's other reasons you can generate more char. If somebody wants to talk about that, we can talk about it later. I'm going to move on. But as a scientist, there was all these potential values, right? And I call it the Great Black Panacea because this is actually a problem for me as a scientist, is trying to prove to people that there's value here, because I'm also an agriculturist and a farmer, and I know snake oil when I see it, right? If it's got this much potential value, there's probably a lot of bullshit in it. And it's also people trying to sell it, right? And so how do you assess this? So I had a very kind of pragmatic way that I was going to go about it. And working with Dr. Marcus Klaber at Oregon State, we came up with this plan years and years ago. To first, we're going to generate power from this biomass, right? We're going to find value in it for us presently. But we're going to do it in a way that's not adding atmospheric carbon to the atmosphere. So we're going to be artful and thoughtful about the way we do it. And we're going to beyond that, we're going to do it in a way that we can make a material that has value, right? That we can improve soil and water resources in particular is the ones I first started focusing on. So at an industrial scale, what happens is you have waste biomass, right? The timber comes in, or whatever, slash piles, we all know that story, or residuals from agriculture. All these things can be used as a feedstock. And the mass balance is on a pyrolytic way, and I think I have a slide on this to try to describe the difference. There's kind of 3 different ways to generate this material. Low pyrolysis, 3 tons of biomass, of dry biomass going into the reaction. You generate 1 ton of the carbon, 16 million BTUs, or 1 megawatt of thermal drive, and the inherent energy to drive the process, right? So that's slow pyrolysis, there's gasification, and there's fast pyrolysis. I focus on slow pyrolysis because I'm trying to make an engineered carbon. The other two pathways is a little bit more difficult to do that. So this is kind of talks about those other pathways. This is just gets back to the waste biomass, the used waste biomass. We have a lot of it. There's been 2 times that the US EPA has done a study that's been called the billion-ton study. The first time it was done, people didn't believe it, so they redid it. But there's 1 billion tons a year of easily attainable biomass in the United States, right? And that's with about, I think it's 25% left for sustainability, labile carbon food sources. And this is and they're only talking in the study primarily agricultural residuals. They pretty much ignored forestry residuals because most of that's stranded, right, in the forest. We all know that there's a problem in the forest. So actually this is a potential pathway for finding value in the forest because we've neglected fire as a resource, right? The native people that grew up here were using fire as a resource forever. We decided we were separate from nature and we were stewards and not part of nature, this bullshit term of stewardship. And we separated ourselves from it. And now nature, you know, that we're separated from it, it's out of control because the fuel loads are out of control, right? And it's not just global warming. Global warming is a big thing, but our lack of understanding fire is a big problem for our forests. So this can do a lot of value for the forest, a lot of value for ecological services. It can also create jobs because fuel loads reduction with control is going to require human hours. The stuff that I was showing you, you can imagine fuel loads reduction in the forest, using that carbon, inherent biology out of the local forests that are healthy that you can extract, put onto that char, and then go do your remediation in the mine tailings, right? All that stuff sitting right there. It's just a matter of putting it together. So now I'll start to talk about water. I started to focus on water quite a while ago because it's a lot of chemistries are similar for the help I'm trying to do for agricultural soils, but engineers would pay for this work, right? And we could do it commercially and get paid for it while I'm trying to understand how to use this material. So I started focusing on what I call water triage quite a while ago. I can't remember, I think I put in my first filter like in 2011 or something like that. So this is part of a study that we did for the Port of Port Townsend, trying to understand how to use biochar to capture heavy metals at a port. Lots of legacy metals from paint and galvanized roof and galvanized fencing, tires, brakes, yada, 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 right? All laying out there. And ports are kind of the bottom of the watershed. So they kind of end up having to deal with all of it. And what we found was that biochar initially did a good job, but if we added organic acid donor to it, which happened to be a reed sedge peat, we went from 200 column volumes to 2,000 column volumes. And I realized at that point, it's always biochar plus something where we really see the value. And it's using this building block, you know, carbon as a building block, right? So then we kind of, through all this, started finding what worked. What we found is that it was really important to wash the media and rinse it so that we knew like flow rates and we didn't lose ash and constituents out to the watershed and kind of got our mechanics down. And now we're really capturing heavy metals at a high degree. So the one filter that I've had in for the longest, or the site, was started in 2016 at least for, you know, like in the real world. And it's an 8,000 square foot roof. They have, I think it's about, well, that bottom chart is that one. You know, we're keeping them under their benchmarks for 8,000 square foot roof for 2 years with 1 cubic yard of the material. It works out really well for these guys to keep them so they're allowed to, so they're not getting fined basically. And then we started doing work with the state of Washington, and now at this point, it's biochar is, as long as it meets the specs, is required in the state of Washington for their low impact design medias. And it took a long time. We started this work almost 10 years ago, and now it's finally in the spec. So biochar can intercept these waters, can help with percolation into the ground. That structure stays around for a long time. Helps with bacteria, legacy toxins, blah, blah, blah. But nutrients was the thing that we really started to work on. Oh, here's another thing is we're talking about restoration. So adding it to hydroseeding benefits the gels and that biology sets up to hold the system in place. It really benefits biology a lot having this stuff in the material. And then we've been using it for seed coating also, and had some really good results with seed coating. So it adds all these things, but you keep seeing I don't have nutrients on there because there's a lot of misnomers around biochar and nutrients. People make a lot of claims around nutrients. I can only talk about what I see in my own lab and my own data sets. It's like, well, on paper it doesn't make sense. In my lab it doesn't work. So I don't know what everybody else is doing, but I think they're kind of making claims that they can't back up. But that building block thing started making me think that if we started, and I started finding things in the literature about adding different minerals prior to the carbonization, prior to putting it into the machine. If I did that, I thought we could get some headway. And then I got contacted by US, or by the Oregon Department of Agriculture first, and then we started phase 1. And this is a group of people that have been very supportive of our work: the Pacific Corps, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Running Y Farm, Oregon Department of Agriculture, the Klamath Watershed Partnership, and the Klamath Tribes Water Quality Lab. So we all know it's a phosphorus limited environment here. So started in 2019 on this work. The goal was to reduce the P runoff. Can we do this in a cost-effective manner? And we're hoping to determine the amount of gallons of water we treat, and then see if we can use it as a fertilizer after we bound up the phosphorus. Phosphorus is a finite resource. In agriculture, there's a lot of talk about like the real problem we're facing as humanity is peak phosphorus, actually. So how do we capture it and recycle it? This is something I've been thinking about since the back of that fishing boat 30 years ago, actually. So I started making these materials in my lab. My lab is at a log sort yard, and it's a couple semi-trailers. And I built a furnace so I could do a bunch of batches of this stuff. I had 7 different media selections that I was trying. We used 100% farm water, a 50-50 split of farm water, and a 25-75 split of farm water, because that curve would give us kind of a longevity curve, right, for how long does the material last, potentially. And that's why we did that. Oh, and then we filtered with down to a 5-micron filter to only be focusing on the dissolved phos species, because if phos is already attached to a little bit of something, I can filter it out mechanically. I'm worried about what can I pull out of dissolved, right, chemically pull it out, because that's a much more difficult pathway. So there's actually 3 that came to the top. One I had to eliminate because there was some metals, oat hull residual feedstock I had to eliminate because there was some metals that were coming off that I don't quite know where they come from. So the base carbon is a wood biomass from the area down here that we got from U.S. Forest Service. You can see at the let's see, the top one is 100% water, so we have better uptake, of course, with 100% water. Phoslock is taking up 52.8% of the total on average. Biochar A, which was dolomite, so calcium and magnesium species came to the top as things that I want to add to the feedstock pre-charring. Those are the ones that came of all the 7. It was like clearly it was magnesium and calcium-based minerals that were the ones that were working. So right now we're outperforming Phoslock already, and personally I think I'd rather use calcium, magnesium than lanthanum, but that's what I think. So anyways, now we went on to a phase 2 of with these bottle tests and reran it again just to get some more numbers. And this was done with 100% water undiluted. And you can see the phosphorus averaged out at 36.5. The oat hull one that I had to toss out was almost 80%. And then the magnesite and the dolomite are in the middle there. So using that extrapolated curve, we came up with, we thought that about a cubic yard of material would be able to create about 130,000 gallons of material, of water was the guess from the lab. So this is all in the lab. And then then we went into the field, installed it in June of 2021 for the first pilot. And then we ran into problems with sediment. But actually, after I analyzed the sediment, it was actually a really good find. And I was surprised that it was a find, but it's got huge amounts of phosphorus in it, almost 1% phosphorus, which is a pretty good fertilizer, actually. So there might be even, and it solidifies as a pretty nice pellet when it gets hard, actually. So I don't know, I suggested maybe put good filtration in there and take that off and sell it as a fertilizer. I don't know, but what I do know is if we're pumping sediment into the water, we're never going to solve this problem. That's really clear from this. There's no point if we don't get the sediment taken care of. So what we found was that these were kind of the findings. I think I kind of already went through the findings. Yeah, so I'm just going to skip that. And then now we're into phase 2. And kind of what are we doing with phase 2? Well, I think we could make the material, the biomass mineral combinations a little bit more mechanically sound by adding additional minerals. These are things that have binding qualities. It's materials that are called pozzolanic, which is similar to what cement does, but natural materials that can do that. Wood ash is one of them. Wood ash has a lot of magnesium oxide in it, a lot of calcium oxide in it. Also has this kind of binding quality that I'm hoping for. The salt rock powder, the zeolite fine powders have a pozzolanic quality, actually have a lot of surface areas and things like that. So these are things that I'm going to add, and I'm in the middle of that right now, doing bottle tests with that to see if it's beneficial or not beneficial. And then we're kind of going to go through it again. I'll come up with 2 selections, and we're going to expand the amount of filters so we get better data. And we're going to do it after some of these treatment wetlands where there's not as much sediment, and I'll have a better sediment control on the front end of it. So is this economically valuable for the region and in general? I'm pretty sure it will be. I haven't done like kind of the economic analysis of actually producing this material at scale. That will be part of phase 2. But if we just kind of look at the back of the envelope, phosphorus sells for $4.30 a pound. Dolomite's about 2 cents a pound. The biomass is relatively cheap, right? Magnesite is the most expensive mineral I was looking at, which is 50 cents a pound. The minerals don't go anywhere when I heat them up, right? They stay. The biomass, I do lose probably 75% of that in that heat up. But the point being, if you look at these numbers, I'm pretty sure I can get in under 430 for production, and I'll be generating valuable heat to use these other chemical constituents that we didn't go into that we can extract out of the vapor phases. So I'm pretty hopeful about what we'll find in phase 2, but I don't get too excited till it actually happens. That's the machine I built and how you can get a hold of me, and that's the end of my talk.
Does the charcoal, after you've used it for extracting phosphorus, also have a fertilizer value or some other method of useful disposal as opposed to landfill?
Yeah, that's where we're going to be looking at it, it should, I mean, the initial stuff I looked at from the phase 1, we didn't grow plants out with it, but it was, best way I could say it is that it's bound, but it's not bound in a way that plants and can't get to it. So it looks like it's kind of a slow release fertilizer, but we haven't done the grow outs yet. We're waiting for phase 2 to do that. So it should work, but that's a guess.
Quick question. So is it economically feasible to produce just large amounts of biochar?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, especially, I would say one caveat is the reason that's happening, I would say one of the main reasons is because the carbon market's becoming real, what I call like the crypto carbon market. So the way that's working is if you can line up everything in a row, I've got my feedstock, I've got a place to put my machine, I've got a market for my carbon, but I can't afford to buy my machine, right? That front end capital, you put all that together and you go to the carbon market and you say, hey, I have all this, I just need the capital for the hardware. As long as you're presented that right and it makes sense, you'll get money up front for that capital. They'll pre-purchase 10 years of your carbon on the carbon market. So right now, biochar is considered a carbon reduction mechanism, which is like the most valuable type of carbon. So it's trading at about $100 a ton. Now, because of the mass balance of CO2 to C, right? It takes 3.67 tons of CO2 to generate 1 ton of C. So if you do your placement right, you place yourself where the biomass is, you know, all this way you get multipliers on top of that. So like if it's trading at $100, it's likely you'll get like a 2 to 2.5 time multiplier of that on this market. I know that all sounds weird, but that's added value to the extent that yeah, now that in the last 3 years, it's been a game changer. And does the economics make sense because of that market?
All right. Well, thanks, John. Super interesting. And I hope, you know, there's ability to scale up, which is really how we're going to solve any of the problems here. Not that any one solution is going to fix everything, but looking forward to the phase 2 and beyond. So